He was really taken by this building to the point that he left a message for all the rest of the Tryon's visitors, which we're still having quite a few, and they enjoy the arts and have justice and morality. And this is Governor and Mrs. Tryon's one of their favorite rooms in the building. That's their library or study. And of course the Tryons had approximately about 485 books in their personal library, and we were very fortunate. We have copies of about 85% of those. All of the furnishings that you see were purchased in England, and even the mantles. This one is also made of pine. It was also found in one of the English homes. Now let's go to the largest, most important room in the building, the council chamber.
Okay. Let me just wow.
This is the room where the laws for the colony of North Carolina, as well as the state of North Carolina, some were introduced, some were passed, and some were not. Of course, the governor would have his 12 councilmen around him. He's occupied a large chairs, 12 councilmen. And of course, the lower house was a larger body and been elected by the property owners. Now, if a bill was actually passed right here before it could come to law for the colony, this is King Joseph III himself would have to give that approval. After all, we were one of his 13 colonies. And over here on this side of the mantle, why, that's his wife, Queen Charlotte. And she's Charlotte of Mecklenburg, and of course, Mecklenburg County. We do have Charlotte, a county seat, and it's the largest city we have in the state of North Carolina, named after her. And that gentleman down there is King George I, and that's the third's great-grandfather. The Tryons also used this room to have their grand balls, and the first one they ever held here was December the 5th, 1770. Naturally, it was in honor of King George III, but also the governor, Mrs. Tryon, welcomed the taxpayers of the colony so they could come and see what they had paid for, because he did get the assembly to pass that he could tax each one of his people here to get this building he so desired, and so forth. He also mentioned in here that the chimney piece was quite handsome. He said to King George III, it has columns of wood and Sienna marble, has the medallions of the king and queen actually on either end, and of course the king's coat of arms in the center. Our state government met here because after King George III sent William Tryon to New York to be the royal governor there, he replaced him with Governor Josiah Martin. And Martin actually lived in the building 4 years, but he did not get along with the assembly, and he found himself leaving in 1775. And the state actually, a provincial Congress met, and they elected Richard Caswell, our first state governor. And he came into New Bern with the bells ringing and everybody happy to see a state governor, and he formed the first government here in January of 1777. Governor and Mrs. Tryon did serve their main meal of the day here when they lived here between 2 and 4 in the afternoon. And usually there would be 4 courses, and there could be anywhere from 3 to 4 to 20 to 25 dishes at each course. Now that depended on the number as well as the importance of the guest. Looks like he's having 4 guests right now, and I think you can tell that this is definitely the seafood course, with the fish and the oysters and the chowder and the butter and the hot rolls, and of course some tea or wines. Now, you know, we were very fortunate that when he lived in New York, not fortunate for him, but fortunate for us, that when his home residence burned at Fort George, he did have an inventory. And so when the Restoration Committee went to England, they had a copy of that, so they knew how to furnish this restoration correctly. And in that, he indicated he owned several portraits of monarchs, and one is Mary Queen of Scots, and she's up over the mantel. But the large portrait down there, that is Queen Anne, and Queen Anne was in power of the British Empire when New Bern was settled by the Swiss and the Germans, brought over by Baron de Grafenried in 1710. So New Bern is named after Bern, Switzerland. And the word Bern in Swiss means bear, so that's the reason that's our mascot, as well as it is in Bern, Switzerland. Now there is an architectural feature in here I'd like to point out to you, the doorway. It was found in an English mansion, it was brought over, and it's what we call deceive the eye or fool the eye, because it is simply painted to make it look as if it's very fancy and carved. So they did the rest of the woodwork in this room to match the doorway. Now, after one of the sumptuous meals had been served, we might continue on into the drawing room of the parlor. Mrs. Tryon, the ladies could have tea, and he also mentioned in his inventory that he had a Chinese tea table with rails and a matching urn table. And of course the whole process of serving the tea is the Oriental influence. And you see her tea chest on the floor. She has several tea caddies, and each one would have a little different type of tea, and she would blend the teas all together. And of course the servant would actually be brought in to actually pour the boiling water for them. And of course the conversation's always been a form of entertainment, but you can imagine how important music was to them in their lives at that time, and they made their own. You see a flute, a violin, and a spinet. Mrs. Tryon's forte was the keyboard. She entertained quite royally here. And you know, the only way Tryon could get to be known in this colony was to travel about the colony, regardless of how difficult the travel was at that time, transportation. And so she was enjoyed traveling, and the Moravians, particularly in Old Salem with Auburn, were quite taken by her musical abilities. Also, I want to point out this mantle too. I told you they all came from English mansions. This was made wood and sienna marble also, but it's the painting that's so important in here. It's a pastoral oil entitled The Huntsman, and it was done by Claude Lorraine, and he was a very famous French artist, and he did that in 1639. At the pediment, the vase and flowers was also a part of the mantle. When the Tryons lived here, they had approximately 20 employees. We do know that the number 1 ranking servant was the steward. The number 2 ranking servant was the housekeeper. No one outranked her except the steward. And the next little room you're going to see is the housekeeper's office in the little parlor. She and the steward both have bed chambers in the basement, and but this is where she would make sure everything was ready and confer with the steward. Well, they really had, according to Mrs. Tryon's wishes, really ran this place. She might even have a cup of tea or fix herself something to eat herself in here. She does have her linen press, her plate warmer over here to the right. She has good dishes and so forth. The jellies back there on this album, on top of the little chest, that's the forerunners of Jell-O, because they could not handle refrigeration, but they had animal product which makes gelatin. All right, we'll move on out the great stairs. And Hawks, of course, the architect for this building, described the great stairs to us and said it's hand-carved mahogany. The treads are black walnut, and it is cantilevered, and so each step supports the one up above. And of course the wall is support, so it doesn't have that visible support we're so accustomed to see it. And he also said that in the center of this great stairs, they placed a dome. And as he said, they glazed it over to allow the light to pass through, but to keep the elements out. And that's the first skylight ever placed in the building in the colony, as they think. Of course, the great stairs was used only by the Tryons and their guests. William Tryon had the building built. That's his coat of arms in blue. He was sent to New York. King George replaced him with Governor Josiah Martin, his coat of arms in red. And when Martin was here, as I mentioned, we had the American Revolution. And as a result, we were no longer 13 colonies under Great Britain. We were 13 states forming a brand new nation. But we did have state governors to be inaugurated and lived in the building before our capital moved to Raleigh, where it is today, and the reason is because the population was moving westward. And that gentleman is Alexander Martin, and he was the 4th and 7th. That one's Abner Dash, and he was the second one. And Richard Dodd Speke was our last state governor to be here. He moved with the government to Raleigh in 1794, but he had the honor, the privilege of being an aide to General Richard Caswell during the American Revolution, and as I already said, General Richard Caswell was North Carolina's first state governor, and he also had another term before the capital moved. Now, after the capital moved, of course, this building was still here, and it was used for various different things, and including renting out some rooms, and so that necessitated having servants here to maintain the building. And the night of February the 27th, 1798, one of those servants, of all places down in the basement, looking for something, accidentally set this place on fire. And with heart pine floors throughout the building and all this mahogany woodwork, they could not save it. But they saved the outer offices because they pushed down the colonnade leading to each one. And the Capitol was in Raleigh, no need to replace the building until people started talking about, Baltimore Latham and other people, wouldn't it be wonderful to replace North Carolina's first state and colonial capital? And they did. And the one you're in today was completed in 1959, April, started in 1952. The first floor of this building is the governmental part of the building. The second floor is the residential. We're now getting ready to go up the great stairs. When we come down from the second floor, we'll use the lesser stairs. The great stairs are used only by the Tryons and their guests. Just follow me up the steps, please. Now, Mr. Hawks, the architect, he really indicated how each room on these two floors were used. And he said all the rooms upstairs were used as bedrooms or dressing rooms or closets, as they called them at the time. They probably were when Governor and Mrs. Martin, because they had 5 children, 6 at one time. But the Tryons had one little girl. So Mrs. Tryon chose this room to be her upstairs drawing room. In other words, this is the family room up here. And if you look in here, you'll see 2 good examples of the Georgian style, the hand-carved doorway and mantel. And I also mentioned that all of these antiques were purchased in England, regardless of their original origin. The exception here is the chandelier that came from Austria. And let's go to their supper room. This is where the governor, Mrs. Tryon, enjoyed light supper sent up to them about 8 o'clock in the evening. Probably leftovers from the main meal of the day. Now, you also see the Oriental influence of this room, because there was some trade going on between the East and West before the Tryons came to this colony. And he also listed many of these items in his inventory. Also in this room, you have a good example of chinoiserie, which was popular at that time. And the best example we have in this building is a combination picture mirror, which was also popular at that time. The gilded wood frame with the phoenixes and pagodas is a little much. And also you notice that is the port of Siam, Nanking, that you do have Far Eastern architecture, the pagoda-like on the eastern side. The right-hand side is more or less Middle Eastern, so it really is a hodgepodge. But that is a good example of chinoiserie. Another thing's interesting, we don't have any portraits of the Tryons. Only one he listed was his father. But that's a George Romney painting. And it's entitled An English Gentleman. And that's how Tryon would have been dressed, because that's 1770. And a good example of how children dress is the brother and sister over the mantel. I'm going to skip this room. This is just an ochre bedroom because it's painted ochre as one of the guest rooms. southwest bedroom because of the southwest side. So one thing you see in here that you didn't in the ochre bedroom, you had the dressing, your bathing, and your toilet facilities within the bedroom, not in a separate room. And also, you walk by the leather trunk. When someone came to see you, if they brought a trunk of that magnitude, that would be the norm, not the exception, because they brought most of everything they had, and their stay or visit could be quite long. Like the Tryons visited the governor in Williamsburg. They stayed almost 5 weeks, and that was considered a short visit. So you did have to entertain, and of course cards was a very popular, as you can imagine. Their favorite game was Lou, which is sort of like our poker. And this being the colony of North Carolina, they certainly had plenty of tobacco there. These two pieces of furniture were actually in the original palace. They belonged to Josiah Martin. Now Martin was extremely loyal to King George III. And this being somewhat patriot territory, he realized that for safekeeping that he sent his wife and family to Long Island, and he himself had to flee the palace. He left everything they had and was confiscated, sold at an auction in 1777, and the ancestors, the Brenson family, returned those two pieces to the Tryon Palace Commission. Now let's go to the next bedroom, please. This is the alcove bedroom, and that's an architectural term because this was built specifically to place the bed in. But see, this was supposed to be for the governor, Mrs. Tryon, because it's on the Trent River. And they would have had a lovely view, but the Tryons had already lived here enough summers that they knew how beastly hot and humid it is here for an extended period of time, and so with the bed placed as it is, be very uncomfortable at times. So this is your third and last guest room. Now let's go down to Mrs. Tryon's closet, her dress. Now this is Mrs. Tryon's closet, her dressing room, and of course she did have to have help getting dressed because that is the corset which laces up the back and it is all stays. And of course women for almost a century were supposed to have a cone shape. In other words, V the waistline down, use the side hooks to emphasize the small waist. And these side hooks are basically what I'm wearing. These are collapsible. As you can see, this wire, the wire's coming out. Hers would have been more or less like whalebone, so they've been much heavier and probably caused her dress to stand out even more. Another thing that was interesting at this time, that's a pocket. And pockets were worn underneath, so part of your dressing you would ask, do you wish to wear your pocket today? So forth. Of course, the stocking is held up with ribbon. And the white area garment is a shift or chemise, buckle shoes or lace-up shoes at the time. It is a shame we don't have a portrait of Mrs. Tryon because so much has been written about her, and she was an exceptional lady. But the lady of the mantle was Margaret Hamilton, a friend of hers, and she was supposed to have been one of the more beautiful ladies in this period of the 18th century. Mrs. Tryon could enjoy this room in many different ways other than just having herself get dressed here. I might call it her getaway. All right, now let's go to the master bedroom. The lights out. You get an excellent view of the pull-out commode in here, and also the bathing facilities on the other side of the bed. The governor's chair where his manservant might be giving him a shave or trimming his hair or something of that nature. And I do want to say one thing about the beds. Each bed has been a different size. There was no standardization whatsoever. If you wanted it 8 feet long, you made it 8 feet long. And you spent more money on the bedding than you did the bed itself. You wanted that very soft, downy. The bedspread up here is handmade. However, it is a reproduction, but it's made of cotton. Now the governor, Mrs. Tryon, they enjoyed breakfast up here. It was served to them about 8 o'clock in the morning. Over the breakfast table, that is a portrait of his father, Charles Tryon. Like I mentioned, that's the only one he listed in his inventory. Now this is the governor's desk and bookcase, and as you see where the curator of all these antiques had pulled out the hidden compartment up here, just enough to let you know it's there, because if it's pushed in, you'd have no idea. Well, the Tryons certainly had money and valuables, but New Bern did not open its first bank until after the turn of the century, so they thoroughly enjoyed the use of the hidden compartments. You see his pistols, because he was a lieutenant colonel in the British Army. And when King George III appointed him royal governor for this colony, and after the American Revolution was over, he went back into the British Army, and he stayed there until he got forced retirement at the age of 55. And he soon passed away at the age of 59. Mrs. Tryon lived to be 86, and they both are buried at St. Mary's Church in Twickenham, England. Now let's go to little Margaret's room.
Curious about the paintings?
It's just the tall ships, and I don't know anything about it, and these garnitures were came somewhere from the Middle East. Most of these pictures and prints in here was places he had lived, or also relatives' coats, or things of that nature, and military people.
Okay.
Little Margaret, their daughter, was 3 when they came to this colony. And it took her father a good 2.5 years to collect enough taxes to get the building started in 67, and then they moved in in 70. She was almost 10, and when she was 7, she'd had a baby brother born. He only lived to be approximately 6 weeks of age. And naturally, they were devastated. You can look around the room and see some of the things Margaret probably would have enjoyed. Her doll furniture, bone china tea service. And it's understanding that Mrs. Tryon's personal lady servant had a lesser bed and probably was in Margaret's closet, so there wasn't someone up here on the 2nd floor to take care of Margaret at all times, other than when she was getting Mrs. Tryon dressed. Here again, the little girl over the mantel is not Margaret. It is one of the king and queen's children. You notice the princess is in a baby dress, but her doll is definitely dressed as an adult. Margaret was a smart little girl. She was fluent in French as she was English by the time she was 9. So she has a very nice writing desk back there. All right, let's go in Margaret's closet. And of course, there's her bathing facilities. Her toilet facility is a little different. She had a little chamber pot, but that piece of furniture that was designed strictly for chamber pots. You notice the little sliding door. All of these toilet facilities, if you notice, have handles on them, so it all could be taken out. Give a good scrubbing, I guess, every so often. And she also had one of the best mirrors that money could buy at the time. It's called a standing or show mirror. Margaret lived to be 30. After her father died in 1788, of course, she was living in London, and she was in love with this gentleman that was in the military. Her mother didn't care for this gentleman, but she and her fiance were going to get married anyway, and they were going to elope. And she slipped when she was going out of her 2nd floor window and fell to her death on the cement patio. Mrs. Tryon never remarried that we know of, and that was those 2 children that had, of course, didn't produce any heirs. All right, we came up as guests of the Tryons. Now we're going down the lesser stairs, which is the servant steps. And if you notice, they go all 4 floors, where the great stairs only goes 1. And because if anybody needed anything, that would be because that was storage then, and it's still storage today. They also put this nice palladium window in here to give light from the great stairs to the lesser stairs. And we're getting ready to go to the basement, and all the way down you're going to see these black leather reproduction fire buckets, and that's to put out fires, not to start fires. Because a lot of people think, oh, well, what did they have over to start the fire? So you have to make clarification on that sometimes.
Okay, fine.
And where we are right now is what we call the central passageway, because the servants that did so much work here would come from the outer offices in the grounds, come through the center door, and use those steps we just used. And the basement had two purposes. You have a bed chamber down here for the steward, and a bed chamber down here for the housekeeper. And the rest of the basement at that time would have been what they call cellaring, we call storage today. And this is the housekeeper's bed chamber. And you'll also notice that she has a lot of linens in here because she would keep the extra linens down here in her bed chamber, and maybe some of the extra special dishes and containers and things of that nature. So they needed any extra linens, they would have to go to the housekeeper, so forth. You know, the restoration for this building, the commission was formed in 45. The restoration got away in 1952. And of course, where we're standing now, it used to be George Street. And US 70 used to come right through where we're standing now. And of course, there was a bridge connected across over the Trent River, and it connected with James City, Moorhead, and Beaufort. And there were homes all here in George and Eden and Metcalf, and there were businesses down at the foot of the bridge. So when the restoration started, the state of North Carolina had to relocate so many families and businesses relocated. But finally the day came for the excavation for this building itself, and they found the original foundation. So this come into the steward's room. Nowhere does it show it any better than right here in the steward's room. And this is, you see, this is the original foundation right here. And of course they have this, but you also see how well the steward lived over here too. So you can see that they had care of clout and rank. There were only two, and Mrs. Tron's personal lady servant lived here. When you go to the stable office and you picture that, remember that is the original building, and it was an apartment buildings when the restoration started. The kitchen didn't burn, but it is a restoration, and they're truly not sure really what happened to the kitchen. It probably straddled two lots when they divided all this property up, and it might have been torn down and then used brick by brick in people's homes in the 19th century. Now this closes our tour today, but before you go, do you have any questions?
I'm curious, the house was here originally and then it burned down and then they built Route 70
That's
through
right,
it?
that's right. Because see,
Ruins and all?
really I think it's fascinating the fact that where we're standing really is George Street. And because, you know, after it burned in 1798, they just got rid of the rubble, hauled off the brick, and tried to sell some of it. and divided, like, you know, when you go to the Dixon Stevenson house or the Dave's house or Jones house, you know, these houses, most of them been moved, but they were part of the complex when they started doing all of this stuff. And so they hauled off all the brick and that, and eventually they did. They extended George right on down from where you go to your ticket office there, right on down to the Trent River, and they built a bridge, and it connected with James City, Moorhead, and Beaufort. I remember it was a wooden bridge, had a curve in it. And there was houses and businesses and everything right through here.
Good grief.
And where your parking lot is, that was all houses. And you wouldn't recognize the kitchen office because it had been porticoed, stuccoed, and all kinds of things done to it, and so forth. But Mullimore Latham was a wonderful thing because the little girl here, she'd always dreamed she wanted to restore that brick building, and she was able to do that. And it has been a great thing for New Bern and the state of North Carolina. And I'm not a New Bernian, but I am a Craven Countyan, so I'm one of the few natives around.